for joining US JET for this timely and important discussion. I'm Jessica Livingston. I was a Hokkaido Jet from 2003 to 2006, and now I serve as the Executive Director of the US-Japan Exchange and Teaching Program Alumni Association, or US JET. We have a wide network of about 40,000 JET alumni throughout the USA and 19 regional chapters that we support as a nonprofit. As many of you know, Jets have all spent time in Japan. The country and its people have become a meaningful part of our respective personal histories, but collectively, this Jet alumni network has really become a champion of Japan. Jets go on to work in every industry and sector, and we're oftentimes the bridge between the US and Japan cooperation, both professionally and on a grassroots level. And our peers often see us as Japan experts, whether the topic is bunraku or recent political shifts. And to be honest, that's a pretty tall order. So I'm really happy to be hosting this panel tonight to explore and help inform our JET alumni community and friends of JET. I think you'll find the discussion illuminating, and although you won't learn anything new about bunraku, I do hope you walk away with a more confident understanding on what new leadership in both the US and Japan potentially means for this relationship that we all value and passionately support. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to give a sincere thank you to the US-Japan Foundation for supporting this event. Their support for and partnership with US JET has been really invaluable to our community. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Moderating the discussion is US JET Vice Chair Jim Gannon. Jim is a longtime leader in the US-Japan nonprofit sector, currently serving as the CEO of Peace Wins America, as well as Senior Fellow at the Japan Center for International Exchange here in the USA. Jim has written extensively on US-Asia relations, global health, development, and civil society, but his most important and impressive job was as a Jet in Ehime from 1992 to 94. We're also joined by Scott Wong, who is a senior congressional reporter on Capitol Hill with NBC News. He has covered 5 House speakers, 2 Donald Trump impeachments, and has many, many stories to tell, including those from when he reported from inside the Capitol during the January 6th attack. Scott started his journalism career at UCLA's student newspaper before going to Hyogo on the JET program from 2001 to 2002. Where I'm very sure he used his journalistic skills to teach some excellent English classes to his students. And Nicholas Cecchini is proof that you don't have to be a Jet to be a Japan expert or spend extended time there. Nick is the Vice President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Nick has a long and really impressive history covering politics that straddle both the US and Japan, which he gained after receiving his master's from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, which is a program which many Jets seem to find their way to. We will be taking questions in the chat, so please post them there, or you're free to direct message me via the chat if you'd like. Jim is going to save some time at the end to address those with Nick and Scott. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Jim to get this discussion with our expert panelists started. So, yoroshiku onegai shimasu.
Jessica, thank you very much. It's great to see people beaming in here from Tokyo, from around the US and many other places around the world. But for me, it's a particular honor to be on here with Nick and Scott. Scott really is, in my opinion, the best of the best among the journalists on Capitol Hill. And I know if you haven't seen him on NBC, I am certain that you've read his writing. And Nick is really one of the top analysts of Japan in DC right now. And he was kind enough to fly back from Tokyo last night to join us. So he's got, fresh news as well for us. We'll be talking about these 2 elections today. I think all of us probably have intense personal opinions, but I think we put those aside, step back a little bit, and I think we can agree these are really monumentally significant elections in a historic sense. And I think, decades from now, we're going to be talking about this. I'm so excited to have this discussion today. Um, Really, in the United States, as we said, we heard the refrain many times before that this was the most important election of our lifetime. But in Japan as well, it has gotten a little bit less attention on this side of the Pacific. But the election really seems to be a historic inflection point in Japanese politics. And so what I want to do today is kind of walk through this here, talk about what happened, really what the short term, the long term implications are for both countries and really for one of the world's most important bilateral relationships. And so what I'm going to do is try to do this in interview format and bounce back and forth from Nick and Scott. And then at the end, open up for questions. And what I do is I'd encourage you to write questions in the chat, and we'll collect those, and I'll kind of squish some of them together, then try to bounce them off of Scott and Nick there. I wanted to start out here, though, and I'll start with Nick. And in Japan, we've really had two elections for a new prime minister, Ishiba Shigeru, in September. And then he quickly called a general election and frankly got trounced there. So, Nick, can you tell me kind of what happened and why should we really care about that?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. It's a pleasure to join you and Scott for this conversation. Well, I think fundamentally the ruling Liberal Democratic Party in Japan was stung by a fundraising scandal, lack of transparency in the use of political funds that really frustrated the public. And former Prime Minister Kishida tried to reassure the public that the LDP would clean up its act, but really couldn't. So he abruptly stepped down, and that led to a leadership race in the ruling LDP, which really came down to three candidates. Koizumi Junichiro sort of represented the next generation of political leaders in Japan. Takaichi Sanae, who sort of represented the conservative wing. And then Ishiba Shigeru, who's been in the LDP for a very long time, was very popular with the public in public opinion polls. Has struggled over the years, though, to establish a rapport with his fellow lawmakers. And there was a runoff, and Ishiba prevailed. And as you pointed out, he quickly called a snap election, somewhat surprisingly, because he was a little evasive about that during the LDP race, and rolled the dice, and the LDP did suffer a loss. And now the LDP lost its majority, and we're witnessing a period where suddenly we have a very robust debate in the policymaking process with opposition parties. Most notably, a smaller opposition party, the Democratic Party for the People, which quadrupled its seat total from 7 to 28. So on the surface, you might think, well, that doesn't sound very significant. But I think that party had a very interesting platform, which was basically about the economy. The slogan for their slogan for the election was literally, "We're going to increase your disposable income." And so now the LDP is flirting with them, and we have a very robust debate about economic policy unfolding. Taxes, stimulus measures, the budget for next year. So I think this election was really about the ruling LDP, which has only dealt with this kind of situation 3 times in Japan's post-war history, suddenly having to have a policy debate about concrete issues that the public is worried about, which any public is worried about, their prosperity. So a little bit of uncertainty, perhaps, about whether or not the LDP will hold on to power. But I also think it's a sign of how robust Japan's democracy is, because the people had their voices heard, and now there's a serious policy debate going on. So this is actually a very interesting period to watch Japanese politics.
And Nick, I want to push you a little bit on it. I think if I'm doing my math right, it's been almost 8 decades the LDP's been in power, except for 3 years when it was out, and that went disaster. It was a disaster for the opposition. I mean, is this the start of Is this the start of political instability, or is this the start of a period in which we can expect the LDP to be in and out of power?
Well, I think in the near term, the LDP has to reestablish trust with the public, and that's going to be a challenge. And I think there's some uncertainty as to whether Ishiba is the person to oversee that process. However, I don't think this election really signals a dramatic shift in Japan's strategic culture or its strategic trajectory. That was established by former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who presided over a long period of political stability in Japan. But I think there's general consensus in Japan that Japan's foreign policy strategy should be about strengthening its defense, partnering with the US and other like-minded countries in Asia and beyond. That's very pragmatic. And so I don't think there's really a debate about that. I think if the opposition gains momentum, it's going to be in their capacity to convince the public that they can deliver more on domestic issues. And I think that's fair to question as well. I mean, I would point out that the largest opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, gained a bunch of seats, but their policy platform has not really changed much. The last time the opposition won in 2009, their platform was very simple: change of government. And that was the right tactic, because the public was frustrated with the LDP then for not talking about economic issues, interestingly. And so that was enough to take over, but they didn't have any experience, as you pointed out. So they were in power for 3 years, and without getting into the details, it did not go well. And here we are 15 years later, and what was the Constitutional Democratic Party's platform? Change of government is political reform. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So they added a phrase in 15 years. My point is, it's not really clear that the opposition has a coherent vision to present to the public either. So it's open sesame. They've got to compete, and we'll see how this shakes out. But again, I don't think this is a cause for concern about Japan fundamentally changing its foreign policy strategy. I think it's about convincing the public of a capacity to deliver economic growth, which Japan, as we know, has been struggling with for many years.
Good. And the comment about capacity to deliver is a good segue into Scott here and what happened in the US a few weeks ago. And I mean, we all know that the presidential election is sort of a seismic shift, but you cover congressional affairs, and not as much change really happened in terms of seats in the House. Do you see what do you take away from this election? Do you see things a little bit differently? I'd be curious, what are the main trends? And well, let me just stop there. I've
That's a
got more
good,
questions, but why
no,
don't
that's a
we?
really good point, Jim. And thank you for having me, and thank you to Jessica, and good to be with Nick. And I see some friends already on the Zoom, Ishigaki-san from the Japanese embassy, who I've gotten to know over the years, and who's on to bigger and better things. So congratulations. You made the point about Congress sort of staying the same, and that's interesting because we saw this really landslide election with Donald Trump's victory over Kamala Harris in terms of the Electoral College. And that's how we do things in the States, as you guys all know. It was a very, very, very lopsided victory by Donald Trump in the Electoral College. Republicans, including Trump, focused on economic issues, unsurprisingly. They focused on inflation. They focused on the high cost of living, as well as border security and immigration and crime. And so those were issues that really did seem to resonate with the American public, with voters. Democrats sort of went back to tried and true, campaign issues, things like reproductive rights that had worked in the past, democracy in the wake of January 6th that had worked in the past, and some other issues. They tried to really emphasize some of the measures that they had gotten through the Congress, things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and said, look, we are building bridges and we are, redoing your highways. And those types of economic, messaging didn't quite resonate as well with American voters. They really were focused more on the bread and butter issues, high cost of groceries, high cost of housing. And, I think most people, when you talk to them in the Capitol, when you talk to political strategists, they agree that was why Donald Trump won the election, that he really was able to connect with voters in a way that Democrats had more of a disconnect with them. Uh, the one sort of caveat here with this landslide election, of course, is that the House and the Senate, yes, the Republicans did take the Senate. Yes, Republicans did hold on to the House, but by a very, very narrow margin. And in fact, when you look at, so this was not a giant wave election like we've seen in some past elections. When you look at some of the key battleground states that Donald Trump won, in fact, the Senate candidates in those same states were where the Democrats won. So places like Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, the Democrat, won in Michigan, but Trump took Michigan. Tammy Baldwin held on in Wisconsin, but Trump took Wisconsin. A guy that I've covered for years and years and knew from my Phoenix days in the Phoenix City Council, Ruben Gallego, won the Senate seat in Arizona, but Trump took Arizona. And so you see a real mixed bag in terms of some of the way the congressional races and the Senate races played out. That's going to be a 53. It looks like Bob Casey just conceded the race in Pennsylvania a few minutes ago, so that now we know the exact number in the Senate. It's going to be 53-47. That means that Republicans can only lose 3 at most votes in terms of getting through Donald Trump's nominees for his cabinet. If there's a tie, then J.D. Vance can step in and be the tiebreaker. In the House of Representatives, very quickly, Mike Johnson, who I've also been covering for years and years, and was elevated to the speakership just last year, he will be dealing once again with this minuscule majority, just a few seats. So if he loses 3 Republicans on any vote, they will not be able to push their agenda forward. And that's going to be a really big deal, especially as in these opening months of the new Congress, when they are going to be trying to push through these reconciliation packages. We could talk a little bit more about what could be in these packages a little bit later, but Mike Johnson, you're going to see Republicans struggling with Republicans, fighting over policy issues to try to get them in the reconciliation package in these opening months. That's going to be a big focus of the new Congress, as well as confirming Donald Trump's nominees.
Thank you, Scott. And sort of two related questions. I mean, the one obvious one is, do you see a radically different agenda for this Congress as opposed to the last Congress? But also Congress, you're on Capitol Hill, you know how much congressional members traditionally prize their independence, from the executive branch. There's signs that things have changed, with the Republican Party and the Trump administration, but we're talking on a day now when Matt Gaetz has just stepped down or just said that he will step back from his nomination here because senators were opposing him. What do you see in terms of will the Congress be independent of the Trump administration's directives, and what do you see coming down the pike?
That's a really good question. That was something that we had been discussing as we were planning for tonight's event, was how much is the Republican Congress going to push back against a Donald Trump presidency, and Donald Trump, who has, as we know, has been vindictive and has taken retribution against anyone who stands up against him in the past, and has ended a lot of political careers here in Washington. But today, as you mentioned, Jim, Matt Gaetz took himself out of the running for Attorney General, probably the most important cabinet job to Donald Trump, because he was talking on the campaign trail about remaking the Justice Department, talking about how he saw the Justice Department as something that was biased against him in all of its investigations into Donald Trump. And so this has really been a priority of his. You know, what we saw was Matt Gaetz on the Hill. And in fact, I'm still in the Capitol. It doesn't quite look like it, but I'm in a tiny room in one of our media spaces. I'm still here. What we saw yesterday was Matt Gaetz going from senator to senator, holding these meetings with Judiciary Committee members who will get a vote in the Judiciary Committee on whether to confirm the next Attorney General and send that nomination to the floor. And from everything that we've heard, everyone was cordial, but these meetings did not go well. And of course, there's this enormous ethics cloud that has been hovering over Matt Gaetz. I was on the House side yesterday where the House Ethics Committee was deliberating whether to release this like 200-page investigation document into Matt Gaetz and some of the sexual misconduct that he's been accused of. Clearly, a lot of senators saw this as very problematic to have somebody who would be leading DOJ have all of these allegations of impropriety surrounding him. And so that was a bridge too far for many of these senators. Now, I will say that we did see them push back in this instant, and at least 4 we know of said, we're not going to vote for Matt Gaetz. At least they were saying that privately to President Trump's team. But, the real question is how many nominees, and there's quite a few controversial ones already, how many nominees can the senators choose to scuttle here? They only have so much political capital. Trump is clearly has burned some political capital in nominating some controversial figures, but senators also are getting a lot of backlash back home from the conservative base. And so there's a real question of, okay, maybe you could stop Matt Gaetz, maybe you could stop a couple others, but probably that's about it. Maybe 3 is the magic number, and then everyone else will get pushed through the confirmation process. I think that's something like that is how this is all going to play out.
So am I correct to interpret what you're saying is there will be some pushback against the more extreme elements of whether Trump legislative agenda down the road, but a lot of that will proceed?
Well, I was talking specifically about the nominees. And so the first sort of part of the Congress will be focused a lot on confirming Trump's nominations. Legislatively, in terms of this reconciliation package, we have seen in recent years, I mean, everyone in Washington has watched a couple iterations of this where you have a unified government take over at the start of a presidency. We saw it in 2017 with Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress, and we saw how they struggled initially to pass Obamacare repeal. They tried to do that through this reconciliation process where you only really need a simple majority, 51 votes, to get it through the Senate. Normally, you would need 60 to overcome a filibuster, as Senate watchers are well aware. And so they spent a good chunk of that year, 2017, fighting each other over Obamacare repeal. We all remember John McCain famously stepping onto the Senate floor, putting his thumb down, and basically killing Obamacare repeal, which Republicans had spent months and months quarreling over. They expended a ton of political capital. They turned next to the Trump tax cuts and were successful in getting through the Trump tax cuts. We are going to see at the start of this next Congress an effort to try to extend those expiring Trump tax cuts. So some of that package is going to be expiring. They don't want taxes to go up on individuals, and so they're going to try to extend those Trump tax cuts. Some of that package, there's discussion, may include tariffs. I know we're going to get a lot into the discussion about tariffs. So some of that reconciliation package that the Congress starts out with could include tariffs, although it's going to be a very heavy lift.
Good, thank you. And I do want to just pivot right now to trade and keep going with you. But first, just as a PSA, I'll encourage people on the call, if you've got a burning question, please pop it into the chat and we'll catch that later. But yeah, we've heard tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. I know a lot of people in Japan are paying attention to that. What are you expecting in the Congress? No, well, on tariffs and more broadly, trade
Right.
policy in
Yeah,
general.
we could talk a little bit. Trade is not my forte. I'm more of a leadership guy. I follow sort of the leadership dynamics, but uh, I did speak in the recent weeks with a number of lawmakers who are focused on trade, who are focused on um, taxes, and what we have seen is President Trump and his former top trade guy, Robert Lighthizer, have really talked about this idea of the tariffs will pay for these tax cuts. And so there is a synergy that they see between these two things. Um, Obviously, if you've been following the news, the proposals that have been tossed out there by former President Trump are up to a 20% tariff on all imports from all different countries, as well as a much more severe 60% tariff from China. And so there is a debate about, who should be the next Treasury Secretary, who's going to have taxes and tariffs under their portfolio. There's a debate about whether Trump picks a tariff guy or a non-tariff guy. We could see the Treasury pick in the next 24 to 48 hours. It's supposed to come very soon. Clearly, there's concern on Capitol Hill about whether or not installing tariffs could undercut some of the campaign pledges that President Trump made, because there's a belief, bipartisan belief, Republicans and Democrats, that if you slap tariffs on all these goods that are coming into the United States, then that's going to be passed on to consumers. And if you've made your central campaign message about lowering prices, making life easier for Americans, what's going to happen when the rubber hits the road and people start seeing costs go up on all of the goods that they're buying from, that maybe are from China or other parts of the world that are cheap, and those prices start to go up, and people start getting sticker shock. So these are definitely conversations that are happening on Capitol Hill as the focus begins to turn to this first reconciliation package, Jim.
God, thank you. And I'm going to turn to Nick here. I'm sure our friends in Japan, they hear 20% tariffs or even, cut it 10% or whatever. I'd be curious to get your sense. How would Japan react to a U.S. trade policy like this? And I'll add that Japan is one of the surprises when President Trump came in, is that Japan transformed itself into a leader on free trade in Asia. And can Japan continue doing that, or does the U.S. Do a new U.S. approach mean that Japan has to change its overall approach as well?
Sure. I think Japan and many other U.S. allies are starting this transition process by studying and remembering what happened during the first Trump administration. And I would say, sort of on the optimistic side of the spectrum, that Japan has seen this movie before. So I think they expect the Trump administration to place a lot of demands on Japan economically. And I also suspect that they'll have some cards to show, and look at tariff policy as an opening to engage in some negotiations and possibly some bilateral economic agreements. How might Japan do that? Maybe energy imports, that might be one area. I also think Japan has a very compelling case to make about its long and proud history of foreign direct investment in the United States, and how that contributes to the U.S. economy and U.S. jobs. And so it's not going to be easy, but Japan is used to this. It's not new, it's not a surprise, and they'll have time to prepare. So I think you could argue that yes, there will be pressure on tariffs, but that's also a window to deal with a businessman who is transactional, but is open to negotiations and agreements. So I think that's probably how discussions on the economic pillar of the U.S.-Japan alliance might unfold. With respect to your question about Japan's leadership on trade, I think that's where protectionism in the United States, and this is a trend that's in both political parties, in my view, really damages U.S. strategic interests, because now we're asking Japan, Australia, and other partners in Asia not only to continue to promote regional economic liberalization, but also to set the rules and the norms for international trade without having an American voice in the game. So if you think about a country like China, which clearly wants to assume a greater leadership role in this area, the fact that we're pressuring Japan and other allies to solve this challenge on their own is quite unfortunate. But I don't see that changing. And so I think the challenge for Japan is to keep demonstrating its capacity as a leader on multilateral trade and setting the rules and norms for the international economy, and also at the same time continuing to explore ways in which it can strengthen economic ties with the United States. That's a very delicate balancing act. But this is something that Japan and other U.S. allies are going to have to confront with a new administration in the U.S.
Thank you, Nick. And I want to run with this alliance piece that you've just mentioned there. I mean, obviously, Japan is our strongest U.S. ally in Asia, along with Korea. But as you said, the President Trump's approach has been, rather transactional, and it's been denigrating alliances. My sense is from even before Prime Minister Abe, Japan's just gone all in on the U.S.-Japan alliance. But I'm curious, how much if you do have this transactional approach, this pressure on basing it stuff, pressure on host nation support, threats not to have, that might undermine faith in the U.S. nuclear umbrella over Japan. How much can Japanese leaders rely on the U.S. as a security partner?
Sure. Again, I would start by reflecting on how the U.S.-Japan relationship evolved during Trump's first term. Granted, you had a leader in Abe who was uniquely skilled at engaging Donald Trump, and found a way to establish a rapport with him. And he had a profound influence on shaping the way Trump thought about Asia. So that is definitely a loss, because we don't have a so-called Trump whisperer in Japan right now. But I would just look back to the message that Abe brought, which is exactly the same now and even more compelling. And the message is basically we're a reliable ally. We're strengthening our own defense capabilities. We're not afraid to stand up to China. We're a global leader, and we're going to work with you economically. And we really want a stronger relationship with the United States. It's a positive message. It's a confident message. And I think that resonated with Trump in his first term. And if you assume that the second Trump administration will be animated primarily by strategic competition with China, then again, I think Japan has a very compelling story to tell on defense, but also areas like economic security, protecting sensitive technologies, making supply chains more resilient. Anything Japan can say that relates to strategic competition with China, I think is going to generate positive momentum with the Trump administration. So I'm not trying to suggest that there won't be elements of friction and there won't be, new approaches to foreign policy that Japan's going to have to deal with. But again, going back to my earlier point about this not being new, Japan should be positive and confident about what it stands for, but also, honest about how much it cares about the relationship with the United States. And I would just close by saying, regardless of what Japanese interlocutors think about the outcome of the U.S. election, Japanese security is dependent fundamentally on the security treaty with the United States. So they have no choice but to work closely with the U.S. administration. And I'm confident that the Japanese government will have a very sophisticated approach to show coming up in January.
Thank you. And Scott, I want to go to you, but I'm feeling our friend Tomoaki Ishigaki looking over us on the call here. What do you hear in Congress on the U.S.-Japan alliance, the U.S.-Japan security relationship, particularly vis-a-vis China?
Was that to me, Jim?
Yes, that is,
Oh,
Scott.
okay.
Do you hear, I
Ishigaki's
guess
not.
maybe
Okay.
is the first question. Do you hear Japan come up much at all in your discussions on the Hill?
So I did talk this week to a number of national security lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, brought up Japan. Just everyone feels very strongly positive about the relationship right now, the state of the relationship. Clearly, as Nick mentioned, we rely on each other. We have bases in Japan. They rely on us for defense support, and so there really is a mutual benefit between and cooperation between the two countries. A number of the lawmakers pointed to the trilateral alliance with South Korea. They said that things really have improved under Biden. They expect things to continue under Trump. Just that there's just a number of really good relationships in the Indo-Pacific region, including with the Philippines as well. And so the one area of tension that Nick sort of alluded to was with tariffs, and this could be the wild card in the relationship. Not that the relationship would fall apart, but just that it could create tensions, and those tariffs could divide, could create divisions between some of these alliances and friction, as Nick said. So those are some of the conversations I was having these past couple weeks. But overall, just a very positive feel about Japan, and also the fact that you have Trump and you have a number of China hawks coming into the administration. You have a number of China hawks who will be in charge of the Congress, that ramping up the rhetoric against China could drive Japan, the United States closer together. And so in the context of China, a number of the lawmakers believed that the relationship would actually grow stronger. Jim.
Good. Well, that's really reassuring to hear. And it sounds like the Congress, even if things start to get out of hand, the Congress can be a bit of a brake on relations deteriorating, going worse than they are. I'm going to change things around a little bit here. And there's a really interesting question in the chat, Nick, that relates to what you were already mentioning before about the relationship with Shinzo Abe and Donald Trump. And as you remember, Abe did something that was very un-Japanese in my mind, a real extraordinary charm offensive when President Trump was, when it was President-elect Trump, he went, broke diplomatic protocol, went to Trump Tower, presented him with a gold golf club at the time. It was not something you expect from a Japanese prime minister. And it was really, I think, key in establishing the relationship, and they did seem to have a strong personal relationship throughout that helped the broader, national relationship between Japan and U.S. Is Prime Minister Ishiba able to replicate that? Do you think President Trump would be even open to that? What's your sense of that?
Well, understandably, I think there's high expectations about the prospect for a close personal relationship between the two leaders. There was an attempt made to have an audience with Donald Trump on the way back from the APEC and G20 summits in Latin America. That didn't pan out. That could generate speculation about the extent to which Ishiba might be able to use a connection with Trump to generate positive momentum for U.S.-Japan relations. Personally, though, I think it's probably not a bad thing that they didn't meet this time. I think, especially given the political environment in Japan, Ishiba's approval rating is stabilizing a little bit. He's getting used to the position. I think in this circumstance, it's better to take a little more time and refine that message I was talking about earlier. I think Ishiba can deliver it, but he said some things in the context of the LDP leadership race that you don't necessarily want to approach a Trump administration with. One was revising the standard of forces agreement between the U.S. and Japan. That's an agreement that essentially governs the U.S. military presence in Japan. The two governments might want to have discussions about that, and they have in the past. But that's a very narrow, technical U.S.-Japan alliance issue. That's not a talking point you bring in your first audience. Ishiba also talked about an Asian version of NATO, which caused quite a stir here in Washington. That's died down a little bit. Members of his administration have said he made that point before he became prime minister. I would focus less on whether or not an Asian NATO is realistic and really focus on the instinct that Ishiba is sharing, which is to enhance defense cooperation with other countries in Asia. That's good. And that's something the U.S. can work with. So I think taking the time to refine the message and get back to a confident Japan that still wants to work closely with the United States is important. So in this circumstance, I think it's better not to rush, and that it would actually be better to do it later once Ishiba solidifies his political footing and is a little more confident about how he wants to engage the new administration.
Nick, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll toss this out at whether Scott, I don't know if this is in your ballpark or not, and Nick as well, feel free to jump in. But Japan, there's a real focus on these personal relationships. There was the Ron Yasu relationship with Ronald Reagan and Yasuhiro Nakasone, and of course, with Koizumi and President, Bush, and then, of course, with President Trump and Abe as well. Do they really affect policy, though, on the U.S. side? Or is that more the media follows it and it doesn't mean too much?
No, I think it does. I think it's a central tenet of politics that politics is often personal. And relationships do matter. And a lot of times in the Capitol, when you hear about, oh, why did you support that person for chairman? Or, why did you vote for that person for speaker? Oh, he came to my district. We had him over for dinner one night. And so, there's often backstories about why, people support other politicians. it very much is personal. And I remember, I'm pretty sure I was in the room for for Abe's address to Congress, and you know, just seeing those two men on on camera, on television, there was a rapport between them. And you mentioned the word replicate. I think replicate is really hard. It's really hard to replicate somebody like Shinzo Abe, who had so much charisma and sort of that personal touch. But I do think that those types of relationships do matter, and can often, when it's just two men in a room, or two men with a couple of their aides in a room, they could really get down to business and negotiate things if there is a personal connection and a trust between those two individuals.
Good. So I'm going to stick with the theme here of the power that people can have in the relationship. And again, Scott and Nick, you can both take a swing at this one, but it's related to another good question that came in that's basically referring to the changes that we're likely to see in the various executive branch departments and agencies. And we'll have the normal turnover, but then there's also a lot of talk with, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy about clearing out a lot of civil servants as well. Do you think that on the U.S. side will impact U.S.-Japan relations? Because some of these, I assume, are the alliance handlers.
I don't have any great insights into how that would impact the alliance. I will say that a lot of these names that are being brought in, you mentioned Elon Musk and Ramaswamy, are some of the the more interesting ones. But Trump ran on a platform of shaking things up, of not doing business as usual in Washington. And what I will say about Trump's second term is that he now has the benefit of having been in Washington for 4 years plus. He knows his way around the White House now. I think during his first term, people recommended all these cabinet officials to him, and he's like, okay, I don't know any of these people. Sure, we'll take him. We'll take Jeff Sessions for Attorney General, and a number of others. This time, he knows what these agencies do. He knows, he's been in the Situation Room. He has been through this before, and so he is coming to the job in a much more experienced way, and he knows what worked last time, and he knows what didn't work last time. And so I really do feel like they are going to be pushing the envelope, and installing individuals who are going to be really shaking up how the federal government works.
That's Nick. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think Scott summarized the dynamic extremely well. There will be uncertainty associated with installing people who do not represent quote unquote official Washington in cabinet positions. But as I said earlier, I think Japan is a very sophisticated ally with a very strong, agile diplomatic corps, and they won't waste any time engaging the administration. But this situation sort of reminds me of the importance of remembering all the stakeholders in the U.S.-Japan relationship, the business community, civil society groups, members of Congress, we've already discussed. The other one I would flag is local government, governors, mayors, people around the country who understand Japan, appreciate Japan, and also are really in touch with what the American people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So of course, Japan is going to engage the administration, but I think this just sort of points out the importance of having a very broad strategy to tap all stakeholders in the U.S.-Japan relationship to make sure that Japan's voice and Japan's priorities are well understood around the country.
And so if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying this is time for Japan to really even step up even more on this broad outreach, state level, local level, national level, um,
Yeah,
legislative changes, et
I
cetera?
think that's certainly a pragmatic approach in the near term to manage the transition to a second Trump administration. I also think it's smart long-term strategy. I don't want to get too far off topic, but you know, the cynic in me thinks that the 2028 presidential election has already started. You're going to have a new leader from the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party has to bounce back from this defeat and kind of reinvent itself. And I think you're going to see a new leader do that. So for Japan, as a close ally of the United States who cares about political dynamics in this country, it would be smart to get to know as many stakeholders as possible looking forward.
Thank you. And this sort of brings a question I've had on my mind, and I'm going to come back to you first, Nick, and then Scott. But it's about soft power. And that's on my mind because, you know, the connection with the JET program, which I think is one of the great engines of American soft power vis-a-vis Japan. But also there's a really good question in the chat about the level of goodwill in the U.S.-Japan relationship on the Japan side. And really, I mean, I think I'm not sure quite how to formulate this, but in a sense, you know, in Asia, we do have a bit of a competition, you know, between the forces of authoritarianism in Beijing and what is seen as the forces of democracy in the U.S. You do have a new president in here who has taken stances that are seen as undemocratic, you know, who wants to roll back global leadership. I doubt you can see, you know, as much U.S. leadership in the G7 or on issues like climate change and health and global health, where often the U.S. has stood out there. In Japanese polling, and I know CSIS does a lot of polling, and it does some in Asia too, surveys, you always see that there's a strong Japanese affinity for the US, for Americans, and for American policy, and US stands out as a model. Do you think that in the second Trump administration, do you see that views in Japan of the US changing?
Well, that's a very difficult question, but let me take a stab at it and do so briefly. You know, is democracy and human rights going to be a pillar of Trump administration foreign policy? You might assume not, but it's too early to determine which cabinet members are going to shape the foreign policy debate in the administration. I would just point out specifically on that topic that Senator Rubio is someone who co-sponsored legislation about forced labor in Xinjiang and cares a lot about human rights in the context of criticizing China's behavior. So it's not impossible. But getting to your point about subtlety and Japan's soft power, this is where I think Japan's coordination with other partners in the Indo-Pacific and beyond is really important. Japan has a long, proud history in the area of official development assistance, where the objective is not to talk about democracy overtly for fear of offending countries in the developing world that don't want to have to choose between the US and China or don't want to be lectured about forms of governance. But Japan is very good about talking about good governance generally and the elements of it. That's economic development, it's support for institutions such as, you know, a variety of ways where the objective is not to start a debate about democracy versus autocracy, but simply to demonstrate that Japan really cares about the stability and future prosperity of these countries, as does Australia, as does South Korea. And so I think coordinating those initiatives and finding a way to engage the new US administration, not necessarily on democracy promotion overtly, but on the elements of good governance that are part of democracy, I think is really interesting. That's a huge lift. It's a challenge, but I think it's a core element of Japanese foreign policy that deserves more attention, because what the U.S. does not do is subtlety, and Japan does that very well, and I think that's one of its hidden strengths.
This is great, Nick. I'm starting to see, I mean, already the formulation of a new approach to the U.S.-Japan alliance coming out from what you're saying. Scott, I do want to turn to you on this soft power piece, and I looked at Mr. Trump and the people around him seem like real hard power guys. What do you see for U.S. soft power going down the road?
Well, before I talk about soft power, I just wanted to point out that one area that we haven't discussed, but that is directly relevant to Asia and China, Japan, Taiwan is Ukraine. Uh, this past Congress, we saw a real struggle for the Congress to pass Ukraine aid, billions of dollars in weapons and military support. And uh, that was with a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate. There is real skepticism clearly in the Republican Party, in Trump's Republican Party, of sending more aid to Ukraine. And I think the way that that connects to Asia is that China and all of the countries in the region are closely watching how the U.S. responds to that military conflict, thousands of miles away, because how the U.S. responds to that is a possible window into how the U.S. could respond to Chinese aggression towards Taiwan or any other U.S. allies. So I think that's just something I wanted to put out there as something to watch, is what happens as the Congress and the president-elect deal with additional aid to Ukraine in the face of this war with Russia. You have a follow-up question?
I do. No, please. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, in terms of your soft power question, clearly the JET program was a formidable experience in my life that, really shaped my views on the world. Just living abroad at that time in my life after UCLA, I was in the Japan countryside, amid mountains. I had a rice field right next to me that I woke up to every morning with the frogs and all the other sounds of nature, and it was just a wonderful experience. And also, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I was there during the 9/11 attack, and so I experienced 9/11 while Americans were sort of bonding back at home over this very traumatic experience. I was very isolated, living in this town of 9,000 people. Clearly, my Japanese coworkers were sympathetic to what had happened and obviously very concerned, but there was also not a shared experience that I was having with my fellow Americans back at home. So just being in a different country for that year really opened my eyes to the idea that, look, not everyone sees the world in this very American-centric view that, for the most part, people do not. And that's something that I've carried with me, that view, as I've covered American politics and the United States Congress.
Scott, I think you've synthesized what soft power can do very well there. I think we're close to the close here. I just want to wrap up to ask you guys, for a few predictions before handing this off to Jessica to close us down. And do you have predictions on who the new U.S. Treasury Secretary is going to be? One, and what names are up for U.S. Ambassador to Japan? Both for you and Nick.
In the last day, I did hear an individual come up who is well known to probably everyone on this Zoom, and that was Bill Hagerty, the senator from Tennessee, who served as ambassador to Japan during Trump's first administration. And although he is not sort of at the top of the list when you look at all of the various lists that the media outlets have compiled, he's somebody that is being whispered about. And so I would keep an eye on Haggerty. I'm not saying that he's the guy, but two people mentioned that to me in the last 24 hours.
Fascinating, fascinating. I guess then, Nick, it's up to you to tell us who will be the new ambassador to Japan.
I'd say Jim Gannon for ambassador. No question.
I second that.
Number one on my list. Regardless of who it ends up being, I think the most important variable or consideration is a close relationship with the president. We saw that in the Biden administration, and it just makes a huge difference in generating the agenda for the bilateral relationship. I'll just close by just sort of saying one thing. Over the course of the history of U.S.-Japan relations at various stages, especially on the security side of the ledger, there were periods where the United States was asking Japan to do more, and more and more and more, and gradually Japan became more confident in its regional leadership role, but also as a global power. I think now that with the transition to the Trump administration, there may be some concern about Japan wanting to do more with a new administration that might want to do less on the international stage. And so I think the Japanese government, through the pipeline established by the next U.S. ambassador to Japan, has an important role to play in reminding the U.S. about how important its leadership role is, and to stay engaged in Asia.
So with that, Nick, I think that's a great message to take home here. I am just delighted that you guys could join. And Nick, I'm so glad you stayed awake now. I know this is 2 a.m. or 5 a.m. for you after just landing back from Japan. Scott, your insights are fantastic. And I'm so glad you've keep Japan with you from the JET program. And I'm glad that you're going to be going back at the end of the year there as well. But with that, I should hand off to Jessica to close us down. But I just want to say thank you for all you've done.
Great. A huge and sincere thank you to Jim and Nick and Scott for spending time with us and sharing your insight in a way that was digestible. And that was really nice. Again, my sincere appreciation for the U.S.-Japan Foundation for supporting USJETA's desire to bring this talk to our community. I think I can confidently say this discussion was really valuable. Jim, I appreciate the reflective questions you brought to the table and the candid responses that Nick and Scott shared with us. And thank you to our engaged audience for your great questions. It's always a pleasure to spend time with JET alumni and friends of our community. The conversations are invariably thoughtful. Thank you all for being a part of the discussion. Have a wonderful evening or day, depending on your time zone. Thanks so much for joining us. 以上でございます。